every 2 weeks in the summer. So this is the second of the History on Location programs, we're calling them. 2 weeks ago, we were in Alden Place talking about Italian immigration in Millbrook, late 18th, early 20th century. 2 weeks from today, the 24th of July, we are going to be on Front Street talking about the history of Front Street and the coming of the railroad and all of that. And so there's 6 of these in total going through early September. And, you're here for the second one, so there's plenty more to come back for the rest of the summer. If you guys have questions as we go through this stuff, feel free to raise your hand or shout it out. Don't mind interruptions at all. I might not know the answer to what you're asking, but John might, somebody here might, so we'll try to figure it out together. So my responsibility was to talk a little bit about the history of Quakers in Dutchess County in Millbrook, and John will talk more about the specific spot here in the cemetery as we go forward. And so the history of Quakers in America basically starts in the 1650s, really early on in the history of America. Around the same time that Quakerism is founded in England, Quakers start showing up in the colonies. And what's important to remember, and I think it's easy to lose track of, is how much intra-religious conflict and hostility there was in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries in both Europe and over here. Conflicts within Christianity itself. So at the same time that Quakers were starting to come to America, Protestants and Catholics were killing each other literally by the millions, right, throughout Europe. And so of all of these different Christian denominations that existed at this time, the Quakers are probably the most outside the mainstream. The easiest to persecute, to target, and that is largely for 2 reasons. One, their religious ideas were a little bit outside of the mainstream. Even mainstream Protestant Christianity at the time. And 2, they were the minority everywhere. Right? And so in Europe you had some majority Catholic countries where Catholics were largely safe from persecution, and some majority Protestant countries, Protestants were largely safe from persecution. Quakers weren't really welcomed anywhere and weren't really the majority anywhere, at least until Pennsylvania was established in the 1680s by William Penn. And so when the first Quakers arrived in the colonies, it's rough sledding. I mean, there are Quakers in Puritan, Massachusetts who are executed for the sole crime of being Quakers. That's it. In New York, which is supposedly more tolerant under Dutch control at that time, Quakers are targeted by Peter Stuyvesant. Okay? Because normally the Dutch, all they care about is making money. But if you're a Quaker, you are too far outside of kind of the mainstream. So they're not even safe there. And so it's not surprising that Quakers often settled in places that were isolated, where they weren't going to be living next to neighbors who were openly hostile to them. So if you think of places where there were early Quaker settlements, colonies, Nantucket, Shelter Island, the end of Long Island. It was called Shelter Island because Quakers sheltered there from persecution. Pauling and Millbrook in Dutchess County, which were pretty isolated places. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in one of these places, right, Nantucket, Shelter Island, Pauling, Millbrook, there's still places that are a little bit isolated, right? There's people, have second homes in these places because they're isolated, right? And I think there's a connection to, 300, 350 years ago when the Quakers were coming. So the first Quaker, as far as we know, in Dutchess County, arrived in 1728. So we're talking about a few generations after the first Quakers who were persecuted in New York and in Massachusetts, 40 years after the founding of Pennsylvania. And that first Quaker to come to Dutchess County settled in what today is Quaker Hill. Pauling, right? What back then was called the Oblong. There's still the original Quaker meeting house from the 1760s, right, that stands in Pauling, a little bit older than the one that we're in right now. By the 1740s, 1750s, there are Quakers here, right, in what back then was called Mechanic, what today I guess we call South Millbrook. And I think it's important to take a minute just to think of what this place was like back then, in the middle of the 18th century. I'm sure probably a lot of you already know this, but there's no Millbrook, right? Everything we think of as the village of Millbrook, there was nothing there. That was just farmland. The name Millbrook wasn't used. The town of Washington, that didn't exist yet. Obviously, that was named after Washington, so that came later. And so the only thing that was really here were small settlements scattered about. Probably the most important of them was Hart's Village, just about a mile that way. You know, there were a few old houses there. I live in one of them. And that was about it. And so to me, it's really interesting to think of what this place was like in the 1750s or 1760s, because you have a group of settlers in Hart's Village who were there basically because the Wappingers Creek is there, and they think they can make money by using water power, right, starting businesses. And then there's a group of people, Quakers, who are coming here because it's pretty isolated, and they think they can worship without fear of harassment. And so we often think of kind of the settling of America in the 17th and 18th centuries, this story of people who were coming to make money. That's kind of the Jamestown story. And people who are coming to practice their religion freely. That's kind of the Pilgrim story. But right here in Millbrook, where we are now, you have both parts of that story, kind of a mile apart, right, in the first two settlements that are here. Some of the families that were here, 1750s, 1760s, you probably recognize some of the names. The Thorne family was here at that point. The Coffin family. The Haight family. Duell family. Mabbits, right, were here. So some of these families are still closely associated with Millbrook. Some of them you know the names because places were named after them, streets and hamlets and stuff like that. They're all early Quaker families. In the 1740s, 1750s, probably on this spot, you had a pretty rudimentary wooden meeting house. It's not clear if there were two structures on this spot before this one was built, or just one. There's some conflict in the sources. But this clearly was not the first building here. This was built in 1780. What's going on in the country in 1780? It's literally the middle of the Revolutionary War, right, when this building is being built. So it's like between the period when we declare independence and the time when we actually win independence on the battlefield. So it's remarkable to think of that all these other things are happening, right, as the American Revolution is going on. The fact that this building is brick is a little bit unusual. It's expensive. You know, if you guys know one thing about the Quakers, it's they don't like to be showy. You know, the early Quakers, they didn't even have headstones, right? Like, we don't know where they're buried out here. I mean, John can talk about that later, maybe. But building a structure like this out of brick is an indication that the people living here are fairly prosperous and well-established by that time. By the way, this building cost twice as much as they allotted for it in their budgeting, so cost overruns. Now, I think it's also important to try to get a little bit of a sense of what this immediate spot was like in the late 18th century. You know, it's very different from the vibe that it has now, which is very kind of rural and idyllic. There was much more here in the late 18th century. This was a little kind of thriving hamlet along Route 343 there. The Thornes had a store nearby. Probably the most important building that is now gone would have been just out that was the Nine Partners Boarding School, Quaker boarding school, that opened in 1795, so 15 years after this building was built. And young Quakers from really all over, in particular New England, would come there and study, students as young as 7, and they would stay there sometimes for years, like without going home. There was no summer vacation or anything like that. So you might arrive there when you were 8 years old and stay there until you were 14 and not see your family at all during that time, which is kind of crazy to think about. But that was a really, really important spot, and a lot of prominent people studied there. The father of Susan B. Anthony, Daniel Anthony, was a student there. Probably most importantly, Lucretia Mott, who is probably, at least in my view, the single most consequential figure ever to live in Millbrook. You know, became one of the leading reformers in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, was at the Seneca Falls Convention demanding the right to vote for women. She came here as a 13-year-old student, spent a couple years studying, and then got a job when she was 16 working as a teacher at that school, which was pretty common back then. So you have to imagine that, you know, when she's 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, she would have been in this space participating in Quaker worship, sitting on these same benches that are the original benches that go back to 1780. It's kind of remarkable to think about. The boarding school continued to operate until the 1860s, when it closed, so a little more than 60 years in operation. But after the 1820s, there was a little bit of a decline in the Quakers living here. That's when there was a big schism within Quakerism, where basically they split in two, between a group called the Orthodox Quaker, who were traditionalists, you can tell from the name, and a group called the Hicksites, who were followers of a guy named Elias Hicks, who were a little bit more liberal and more interested in reform and kind of engaging with the rider world. And so in 1828, when this split happened, you know, it's hard to imagine this almost, but they literally divided the land here. And so the Orthodox group got control of Nine Partners Boarding School, and the Hicksite group got control of this meeting house and the cemetery. And it was so acrimonious that the Orthodox group actually built another meeting house, like right out there, where they could meet. Like they couldn't even share the same space. And so after that, I mean, there were still a large number of Quakers here. The 1820s, it was probably about 15% of town of Washington's population, so not a majority, but like a decent chunk. But things started to decline. Like I said, the school closed in the 1860s. In the 1890s, that's when this property was turned over to an organization that started to take care of the cemetery and the graves. But, I mean, look around. This hasn't really changed since 1780, which you probably can't say about too many places. You know, there are places that have been restored to look like they looked like in 1780, but this place hasn't really changed. Maybe John can talk a little bit more about, you want to talk about this building or the cemetery, whatever you prefer.
Both if you want.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm going to sit over here because I'm just at the tail end of Lyme disease. One thing about this building, it is as if it opened yesterday, this is the way it was. All this timbers, the boards, the floors, the benches, all came from local trees. And we've been offered a fortune many times. People want to buy these benches, put them in their house and everything. They want to buy the flooring. If you look at all the windows, you see how they're kind of blurry. Those are hand-blown windows, except if a storm or a bird hits them and breaks them, we replace them. Those are all hand-blown windows. And last year, Mrs. Perkins, who lives up the road, paid a bunch of men to come in here 250 years later, they took all the putty out of the windows, re-puttied the windows, and put 2 coats of paint on them. Twice she has had, she paid for the, what little wood there is exterior, under the eaves and everything. But other than that, this is the way it was, except there's 2 of these pot-belly stoves, one on each side of the building. Those are probably early 1800s, and they used that for years and years to heat. There's an organ over here in the corner. That's Victorian. That's probably 1880s, 1870s. But other than that, this is the way it was in 1780. And right here, I opened this door and that door. And if you were to go out that door, there's like a 5.5 or 6 foot drop. People used to drive their carriage up to there, and the women and children stepped right out of the carriage into this room. Now this building here is divided in 2 right here. This was the men's side, and on the other side was the women's side. And if they were having a service, these panels right here, you can see them, they all slide up and down. If they were having a meeting, the women could not take part. The men ran the meetings, and they dropped those panels down, and the women and kids were on the other side, and the men over here. And that's the way it was in those days. Nobody squawked. That was their religion. If you notice, there is, other than the mortar on the walls, which we're going to have fixed in the next year or so, because it's 250 years with no heat. The plaster is starting to crack here and there. I'm going to have it all fixed up and everything. But it's just a focus on that period. And upstairs here is just like Yankee Stadium. There's 5 rows there and a couple here, 5 rows here on the other side. If anybody wants to go up, I've opened the doors, 2 or 3 at a time. It's plenty safe up there. And when they were having a men's meeting and the kids were bored, they carved all of these benches, like right here next to me, and many of these benches have the date, the letters of the kids. They carved in little sayings here all through, and they have never been touched since those days. Now, outside here, we know that right across the McHugh right here toward 343, we have found out there are many Quakers buried, but they did not use coffins or stones. A little bit later, 20, 30 years later, we found some stones out there about this big, and they might have something dug into it, maybe somebody's initials. But we don't know what's close to this building. And we have someone later this year who works over here at the Cogner Estate, does radar. And he's going to do all the way around this building a radar scan to find, we don't dare dig there, so people say, well, I'd like to be buried next to the Quaker meeting house. And we said, we can't. We've over the years tried 1 or 2, and you get down and you hit a body. So this guy has told us with a radar scan, he can locate bones and bodies. So we're waiting for that. The building itself is like a fort. It's as good as it was the day they built it. When we first took it over about 15 years ago, we had to take off the entire roof right down to the beams. Put on, of course, it was 200 some years old. And we had plywood, new plywood put on, and new shingles put on the entire building to preserve it. And right now, it's as sound as can be, except for the plaster that's starting to crack. Now, I was going to tell Robert, just close to the building here, just a few of the people that I'm sure many of you, if you just came to Millbrook, you would know, but others would know, who are buried close to this building. There's 2,700 people buried in this cemetery right now. And we have room, we purchased some, another 4 or 5 acres a few years ago. And we're probably good for another 100 years. And we still have quite a few plots in here. But close to this building, the Haight family, H-A-I-G-H-T, in Millbrook, probably has 150 graves in this cemetery. Now, years ago, where the liquor store is in Millbrook and the post office, that was, the railroad tracks went right through there. And Paul J. Haight sold coal, oil, and lumber. And the trains would bring the lumber from New York. And that was a huge business in Millbrook, even before it became an incorporated village. And I know that there's over 100 Haights buried here. And if you go up in Mabbittsville and go out to the north, there's Haight Road, and the Haights own hundreds and hundreds of dairy farm up there. So they're one of the real well-known ones here. Right up the hill, right behind the garage over here, is Edgar Downing. In Harts Village, where Robert lives, the Downings owned hundreds of acres of orchards when I was a kid. And they had a big, big business. They even had on going up that road there, Valley Farm Road, they hired local women and kids to process apples to go all over the East Coast. Right outside the building, not 20 feet away, is Charles Johnson. Charles Johnson was a black athlete in Millbrook, outstanding, and they said that he would have to go to Arlington High School to get a scholarship to college or to go to the pros. Now this was like 1949. 1950, Charlie Johnson got killed in Korea, but not before he rescued and saved 7 or 8 of his fellow soldiers. But he was killed, and he got the Army's highest award, and it's been pushed for quite a few years to get him the Congressional Medal of Honor, but they never got that far. They did name in South Carolina at an Army base the Charles Johnson Army base, but he never did get the Medal of Honor. And he's only about 30 feet here from the building. Heman Gifford, right up the road, past one car you can see here. Heman Gifford owned both sides of 44A. And there's a big stone place there. The Cary Arboretum owns it now. That was Heman Gifford's home. And when he died, he left it to his daughter, Sally. Now, Sally Gifford, you would all know, she just died last year at 92 or 94. She painted murals all over Millbrook, including in the Millbrook post office on the walls. There was scenes of Millbrook. Our group, the historical group, has Christmas decorations that we sell, made out of plaster and everything. Sally painted and drew all of those. And in the Millbrook High School, she had paintings all over and was a philanthropist. Right up the hill behind the garage here is the only mausoleum above ground in the cemetery is a guy named Harry Thatcher. Harry Thatcher lived up in Lithgow, and he was a well-known national hunting and fishing writer. Also up the road biggest, actually now it's three, the three biggest plots in this cemetery. One of them is owned by the Thorne family. Of course, you all know the Thorne family here because of the big mansion coming into Millbrook. But they also, the Thorne family over the years, donated the old Millbrook High School. They donated the firehouse in Millbrook. To this day, they still, the tribute garden in Millbrook, that beautiful gardens as you come in, that was built by the Thorne family to honor World War I soldiers. And they backed it up with millions and millions of dollars. So that will be kept as a park forever. But it cost the village of Millbrook nothing. And the same with the village green. That's where the trains used to come through. They had that all planted into grass and flowers and bushes. So the Thorne family's played a major role here. Next to them is another 40 by 20. When I say 40 by 20, you're talking 18 graves. The McHugh family here in Millbrook. The McHughs out past Madisville toward Lithgow own hundreds and hundreds of acres. But Jesse McHugh, who just died this past year, is credited with turning out the first thoroughbred Black Angus in the United States. And he founded the U.S. Black Angus Association. And when you have baby Angus, just like you have a pedigree on a dog, this group registers Black Angus, and he was noted for that all over the country. And north of Madisville, altogether in the town of Washington, Stanford, and Amelia, Jesse McHugh had 5,000 acres. Now, he just died this past year, and it's in the process of being divvied up amongst his several surviving children. But much of the land, he was a big conservationist. A lot of his land is going to go into the Dutchess Land Conservancy, where it can never be developed. It'll be forever wild, so that's another one of our great families. Just a couple of years ago, right over the hill here, we buried Rick Ocasek. The younger people might remember him. He was a rock musician, and he led the band The Birds.
Cars.
What's his name?
The Cars. The Cars.
What?
The Cars.
Clyde?
Cars.
John, it wasn't the Birds, yeah.
Okay, well anyway, he lived right up this road here on Altamont Road. And he bought an enormous plot, and he's got a beautiful monument there with music notes carved into his stone. It's a huge, God, it was a 6,000, 8,000 pound stone with all musical things all over it. In fact, they came and they put the stone in a year or so ago, year and a half ago. And I got a phone call 2 days later from the people on Staten Island that brought the stone. They wanted the stone turned around the other way. Because, believe it or not, I'm up here quite a few days a week. You can't believe the people that come to see Rick Ocasek's grave. So they wanted his name the other way, so they couldn't find it so easily. And I've got to go over there a couple days a week and take away dead flowers. They put gifts. The other day there was a whole bunch of change, nickels, dimes, quarters, and everything. But they come to Millbrook just to see Rick Ocasek's grave. Also going up this road on the hill near the Thorns and the McHugh is the Reverend John Lyle's grave. Now, for 40 years, from 1881 to 1922, he was the pastor of the Federated Church in Millbrook, up by the old high school. And when he died after 40 years, they named that church the Lyle Federated Church. A lot of people don't know that, but that's where it came from the Reverend Lyle. Also up on this same hill is George Perkins. Now George Perkins owned just beyond the Dutchess School here going toward Dover. He owned both sides of Route 343, both sides of the road going to Mabbittsville, and both sides of the road going up to Chestnut Ridge. Now George Perkins inherited a lot of money from his father and grandfather, and he owned Walbridge Farm over here, which was also Black Angus. And when they started the Dutchess Day School, George Perkins was the president of it and put up a lot of the money. Over the years, his family, now his wife, who's 94, just gave the Dutchess School over here, I don't know how many acres for athletic fields for that school. But they have also given to this cemetery for 50, 60 years, the Lyle Federated Church, and other projects in Millbrook, and also paid, for this building to be painted twice. And a number of years ago, 15 or 20 years ago, before I was working up here, Mrs. Perkins paid to have all the roads in here blacktopped. So a lot of these wealthy people in Millbrook, care, and it really shows. Jared Perkins, what else we got over here? Oh, right up on this hill too. Well, this stretch here going across this top road, we call it Millionaire's Row. Just because in those days, they all bought property next to each other. It was Colonel John Winslow, and he lived over here off of Altamont Road. And when he died, he and his wife set up scholarships at Millbrook High School, Winslow scholarships. And for 40 or 50 years, they gave 2 scholarships a year to seniors from Millbrook High School. Also up here on this same side is Charles Dyson. You know, the Dysons here in Millbrook, they own going to Burbank, both sides of the road. But Charles Dyson was an industrialist who made hundreds of millions of dollars. And they too have given money to many, many projects in Millbrook. And so we're lucky to have had a lot of wealthy people around here, but they didn't have to do this. But that's their way, and we thank them because they've helped the cemetery keep going. It costs us a lot of money every year. It costs us $50,000 a year without opening the door. So by the time we pay for lawn mowing and trimming, and then if there's more than 2 inches of snow, we have it plowed every day, and not that many people are dying and being buried here anymore, and thanks to these people, we can do some of these projects. And one of them would be that radar project, trying to find out who's buried out here. And we need more work done on the road. And in here, I'd like to see the plaster. You don't see it where you're sitting down here, but upstairs, the ceiling and the walls are starting to crack. But every time we generally go to these people, they say, fine, we'll help you out. And if they didn't, we'd really be up the creek. So, anybody got any questions about this building? Yeah, go ahead.
What happened to the murals in the post office that were painted there?
That Sally stuff?
Yes.
Sally Gifford stuff?
Sally Gifford's murals.
She moved to South Carolina about 10 or 15 years ago. She gave it to the Millbrook Historical Society to auction off. And any proceeds were to go to the Millbrook Historical Society. Well, we had the auction, and maybe 20 people showed up. And Sally was good, great. And some paintings went up, and I bought 3 for
So they weren't murals painted on the walls?
Those were in the post office
But
in
that's what I
Millbrook
meant.
till last year.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, one day, they painted all the walls and painted right over them.
That's what I wondered.
Yeah,
That's a shame.
it was a shame.
Yeah.
The high school, the old high school, has some of her paintings. And the rest of them, she named a guy here in Millbrook, I can't think of it. He has the rest of the paintings. But anyway, I bought 3 paintings that had been framed the week before. $22? So they put some more paintings up. And I bought a couple more. And I stopped bidding because I didn't want to be a pig. Let other people have some. And they didn't sell and they stopped the sale. But I think I have 7. Yeah, she was very, very good. And like I say, we sell Christmas ornaments about that big around that she hand painted. I think in the Thorn building up here there may be some paintings. But it was really a shame that, you know. And her family's house on 44A, the Carrie Arboretum. I was at Sally's wedding, 1959. I was 18, and she invited me to it. And what do you buy somebody who's worth millions of dollars? And I asked a couple of people, and this one woman who I was working for here gave me a cake dish with a stem going up and beautiful glass in it and everything. So I went to it, and in those days, the entire house was surrounded by flowers, just like the tribute garden is. There was paths everywhere, and every flower that would grow here. So she sold it to the Carrie Arboretum and built a house across the street on about 70 acres. She built the house and got married. She didn't get married till she was like in her 50s. So she never had children.
Is that the brick house that's there now?
The brick house that's there now is her father and mother's house. And she sold it to the Carrie Arboretum. A couple of years ago, the Carrie Arboretum changed direction. And they know they're not going to take care of the environment anymore. They were going to do studies on something. They tore out all the gardens, acres and acres of flowers. So now you see it's just a plain brick building and hasn't been used in years. But it was a beautiful place. She was very upset about that they, didn't maintain it. So, anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
Where were the bricks sourced?
Where the what?
Were the bricks sourced from Cementon, like across the river? I imagine that Rosendale
It
Cement
was
was
all
probably-
made here in those days.
They made the
Right
bricks
here in Dutchess
too.
County. Yeah, maybe even here in Millbrook. Those are all handmade bricks. And it's amazing that they are so perfect today.
Yeah.
And a couple places we had a little cement put in. But other than that, it's the way it was when they produced this building. And you look at these beams, my God, today, where would you find over beams as thick as these? So they offered it to the cemetery if they could use it on Sunday. another, and I'm sitting there going, oh, wouldn't you think somebody would call me on my cell phone? So I sat here for an hour and 15 hour and a half listening to all this, and finally where Robert is sitting, the elder was sitting there, and then he stood up and talked for 15 minutes. But I had no idea what the service was like. There is no actual service. They all come in and meditate and then say something that's on their mind. So, yeah, I kind of got it. But it was interesting because I had no idea. Very, very nice people.
It's called a silent meeting for worship.
What was what?
The Quakers call it a silent meeting for worship.
Yeah.
So there's no minister, and you.
And they just sat here for an hour and a half like this. And I'm over there, what's going on here? And I'm still, like I say, I'm going, oh God, if only my cell phone would ring, I'd have to go, excuse me. It was a learning experience for me, because I had no idea. But on a good day right now, they might draw a dozen. But I think at the Lyle Federated Church, they meet there in the wintertime, and they might have 4 or 6. There's not many practicing around here, still practicing that.
John, we should ask if there's any Quaker here tonight. Do we have any Quakers here tonight?
I wouldn't know, they would have to put their hand up. Oh,
Up in the front,
Jonathan Boyce, maybe.
up in the front was called the facing benches, and that's where the elders sat. The raised area up there. And almost all meeting houses have that.
No, there's very, very few of them left. And I was talking to Jonathan at the farmer's market today, and he still goes. He said in Connecticut there's a couple active churches, and Washington Hollow Cemetery. A lot of Quakers down there, but not, people that died years ago.
Well, there's an active meeting up on Bull's Head Road, and it's actually, the address is Clinton Corners, but we think of it as Stanfordville.
Yeah. And in Clinton Corners itself, there is a miniature of this building the Quakers had. And they had to give it up a year or two ago, gave it to the town of Clinton, because they couldn't maintain it. So the state law says when, somebody turns over a church, the town has to maintain it. But
Well,
that's
the
the only
Grange owned
ones-
it for a while, and then the Grange kind of fizzled out. And now it belongs to the Historical Society.
John,
Yeah, there's not very many left, yes.
I just wanted to mention when you're talking about the quiet meeting, my mother's people were all Quakers, and when she was a little girl, she went to a funeral, and no one said anything. So she said to her grandfather, "Why didn't somebody say anything?" And he said, "Well, if he was a good man, everyone knew it, and if he wasn't, better nothing said." But if I could make just a couple more comments. I'm Lee Cornell, and I live in Millbrook. And my family came from Holland 10 generations ago as Quakers. And they moved from New Amsterdam up to Dutchess County and lived for generations in Dutchess County. And I learned so much today from this meeting that it made a lot of sense that when they were here in Dutchess County, it was in the 1750s, and I didn't know why they would have come here, but now I know more. And now I know a little bit more about when they left around the 1840s. They left to go to Iowa. It was a newer state, and they were starting in a Quaker seminary there. But when my family were here, well, let me fast forward. I was then born in Iowa, moved out to New York, and looking for like a country house, and I ended up in Millbrook. And my mother always was interested in family genealogy, and she said, "Well, have you ever heard of 9 Partners?" And I knew up the Taconic there's a 9 Partners Road. and have you ever heard of Arthur'sburg? And she started giving me all these names. And so she came up one time after retiring to North Carolina, and we went to a Quaker meeting, and I met Jonathan Boyce. And my mother's maiden name was Boyce. So I'm a shirt-tail cousin of Jonathan's. And also one of the first people I met in Millbrook was Allison Scott Meyer. So I just like, it's really wonderful to be here today behind the two of you, and how much you've met in my history in a lot of ways, and I'm not going to get into that right now. But anyway, when I started looking into the family history, it turns out like a lot of my ancestors are buried here at Nine Partners Cemetery, and my great-great-grandmother, her brother was a teacher, Reuben Dorland, at the Nine Partners School. And what I've inherited, I mean, thank God women are needleworkers, and I inherited my great-great-grandmother's sampler. Needled in 1844 on the death of her first child. Edward Francis, and a year later she had Francis Edward. So she just, like they did at the Quakers, they use names. I mean, I would like to take this moment to present to the Millbrook Historical Society something that's been handed down to me for generations from my great-great-grandmother. I'm going to get very emotional about this, but this is where it really belongs with the Millbrook Historical Society. These are copybooks from around 1830, and it has all the names of people who are buried here that wrote in here in beautiful penmanship some poem and signed it, and also copies of poems and religious verses that Lydia Clark Dorland wrote herself, and really caring about history and knowing that my children are probably not interested in it. Really the place that this should be is the Millbrook Historical Society. So other people in the community can enjoy this and look back at the past and the beautiful things that were written. And it's to thank Kathy Derringer for the wonderful work she does as an archivist, John for the work you do here at the cemetery. I've just become a property owner here. So I feel like it was meant to be that, you know, it's like a big full circle that I should join my ancestors and my Quaker roots to be here today. I want to thank you very much.
I don't know if I'm related or not, but my last name is Hicks. And I don't know, the family goes back to the second ship that came after the Mayflower, and they settled in Fishkill and East Fishkill. My grandfather had a meat market here in Millbrook for 40, 50 years, and he was mayor of Millbrook. My father was born here, and so on. And I guess I was born here. We lived in Millbrook. Actually, I was born in Vassar, but I was a year old when we moved to Amenia. So I've got loads of relatives out here in the cemetery, all the Tripps and the Hickses and Buttses and so on. So. Well, I gotta say it, our big problem was that section where if you came in this road going toward the golf course, somewheres along the line they lost all the paperwork to all of those graves. And we can't sell anything over there until with this radar thing comes. And there are big open spaces, but we need to have the radar tell it, you know, are they available? In fact,
No,
I just had somebody.
I found the deeds to my grandfather's graves out here,
Oh, really?
and also my father's and my sister and my mother.
Well, we're hoping that this radar thing works for us so we can even find out what's close to this building. I've had people want to buy a grave because they're Quaker close to this building. can't do it. We don't know what's here. So hopefully, Cobner over here and the man that works for him is he'll do this for us and give us an idea. So, but the rest of the cemetery, since I took over, many of the records were never kept. And Carl Lindholm here in Millbrook, who's 92, he was the cemetery superintendent before me. We have spent hundreds of hours looking at the index cards we have, and every grave in here is supposed to have 4 corner markers. If your name is Jones, there should be 4 J's. Some of those things have sunk 6 to 8 inches deep, and we've been locating them. We know, according to the card, how big a plot they have. And just to get an idea in the cemetery, all the new section is no problem. The older sections were just up in the air. So it's kind of complex thing to do, but we're working on it. So, anybody have any questions for Robert?
Well, thank you all for coming. It's been great. Feel free to wander around for a minute. Like John said, if people want to go upstairs like 2 or 3 at a time, you can do that. If anybody needs a card with the schedule of the rest of our summer talks, I have them over here. But thanks for coming, everybody. Great to see you. Thanks.
Thank you.